My name is Carly, and I'll be talking about children, a history of how they lived and what they wore from the 17th century to the 20th century. So, adults really thought that children should be humble and submissive, kind of like the quote you may have heard children should be seen and not heard. It was really expected of them to have good manners and to be very courteous as well. It was just really looked to them to be respectful of all adults and especially their parents. One big reading from the Bible that children followed back then was the honor thy father and thy mother. It just really, again, to show that they needed to be very respectful towards them. It was their parents that really made all the decisions for them because their parents were teaching them skills to survive. So it's really what a child's life was about, is learning how to live on their own once they reach that point in life. So many children worked as early as 4 or 5 years old back in the 1600s. Boys would normally be seen on the farm helping out, and girls would be in the home sewing or baking. So when they did have school available to them, they would go after all the morning work was finished. So we see here the dame school was when a woman would welcome kids into her home, and she would teach them just all of the basic writing and reading skills of what she knew as she continued her work responsibilities within the home. So it was a very small group that she would normally welcome in. We also have the one-room schoolhouse. So that was just a big room that students would enter into and learn from there with a teacher. And a payment for the teacher back then would be to bring in logs to keep the house very warm. And it was very different compared to now in terms of strictness. Back then, students would stand when the teacher would walk in and then stay standing until the teacher said they could be seated. And then discipline also was very different back then. They would physically discipline by whipping, and then there's humiliation oftentimes too as a discipline. And you can kind of see that in that picture here of the dame school, that little boy in the left wearing that hat, which we will come to later. And then also what they learned from. This is the horn book, this wooden paddle with paper tacked to it, and it would have letters and prayers and different readings from the Bible sometimes, and students would learn off of that. Again, the Bible was big too to learn out of. And then they also had the New England Premier, which was almost like the first textbook, which mixed letters from the alphabet and different Bible readings that the students would learn as they would use their feather pens and ink to write. And then after reading and writing and basic math skills were mastered by the children, then they would leave school and oftentimes do apprenticeships to learn a trade to get into that field and really start working. Oftentimes boys would do different things such as blacksmith or a printer apprenticeship. Girls you would see doing dressmaking or weaving. So how children had fun back in the 1600s. So really they didn't have a whole lot of time to play because they were working a lot. But the games that they were able to play were really games that helped shape their mind and their bodies, because again, really everything was about having some sort of value to learn, something that would help them later on in life as they grew. So some popular games, they would race each other, knots and crosses, which we know as tic-tac-toe, kites and marbles. Also, they would play all hid, which is our hide and seek. Also drafts, which is checkers to us now. And they also liked jokes and tongue twisters as well to tell each other. So the costume of children back in the 1600s. So keeping in mind that adults were raising children to be able to survive on their own was kind of a theme back then. Really thinking of they were raising mini adults, which led them to dress like mini adults. But starting off with the younger children, there wasn't really a difference between gender back then, so oftentimes you would see both boys and girls of young ages wearing dresses. So girls really wore dresses throughout their lifetime, but boys would wear dresses normally under 5, 6, 7, because this was very easy and convenient for young boys. They would wear these skirted outfits until they were old enough to handle the buttons or hooks that pants may have required back then. So they didn't have an easy Velcro or elastic to slide over. So until boys could learn how to dress themselves using the buttons, they would wear dresses. And then with those dresses, they would oftentimes wear long aprons to keep it nice and clean, because really it was about looking presentable still even as a child. So they would have the nice long apron to cover them. And then they would also have little chains around their waist, as you can see here, and there's a bell hanging off of it. So that's kind of interesting. It was there because as a young child you would wander off, so the bell or a rattle sometimes would be on there as well, would make the noise as they're running around. So then their parents or other adults were able to keep track of where they were when they would hear it. Also, kind of another way to keep track of children were called the leading string. So it's kind of, as you can see in the blue dress here, it attaches at her shoulder and then hangs down all the way kind of to the end of the dress. And as well, in the other picture with the bell, you could see he's holding one, and then the adult behind him is holding the other one. So this is kind of like a leash. It would keep track of them. It would help them, especially toddlers who would kind of waddle around if they fell or something. It was kind of easy to catch them. But really it was just to keep children close and not from coming too far away from the adults. Children also often wore these pudding caps. So these were really made for protection. Mostly toddlers would wear them. They would help just in case toddler would fall, because again, they were toddling around a little off balance. So if they fell, it would protect their head. So then once boys were deemed mature enough, you would see them more in their able to wear their breeches and waistcoats and hats, and they would start really looking like mini men. But again, that was once they were able to handle it themselves, getting dressed themselves. And that time period in their life was called breeching. So again, in all, children were just meant to look presentable and look like mini adults. And as you can see with some of these examples, they really don't look anything like you may see kids today. They look very formal. So now moving on to life of children in the 1700s. It was very similar to the 1600s with the idea of raising mini adults, teaching them things that will benefit them later on in life. But it was also a really increasing trend of just everything having some moral learning value behind it. So even things such as children's books had always taught a valuable lesson, which you can kind of still see in children's books today often. But it was just even their toys had some type of lesson or skill behind them, such as boys playing with little microscopes or something of that sort, and then girls having their toys being gardening tools. In the 1700s, there were really two major influencers back then, and that just really also influenced childhood development back in the 1700s. So first we'll start with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he just believed that males specifically should be isolated with a tutor and learn their basic reading, writing, math, and also just learn from nature and the child himself, just really kind of giving that time for him to think and develop on his own, along with the guidance of a tutor as well. And he also said that children were good by nature and were only corrupted by exposure to society. kind of back in the 1600s, it may have been seen that children were born with almost like a sin and needed to be corrected, and that's why it was so strict on them about having good manners and just being mini adults, really growing to become good citizens. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that it was kind of the other way around, where they were just born great people and then society kind of corrupted them. So it was everyone's kind of job to teach them the right way. And then John Locke was having similar beliefs and theories as well. He said that children need moral lessons and really argued that the child should learn best from experience rather than, say, physical punishment. It was really that his experiences were what kind of shaped them into learning right from wrong. And then he also influenced children's literature a lot because he believed that children really should enjoy reading. So that's kind of what started having more books being written for children. So schooling for the 1700s was pretty similar to the 1600s, just that students were working and really could go to school when they could. But a new thing was Sunday schools were created by parishes, and oftentimes lower class kids would go to these schools. But there's still the dame schools going on, still very popular, which was still, as you can see, a larger group here. The women would teach from their homes and continue on with their work throughout the home as well during the day. But school meant different things to different classes. The lower class students often worked, so you wouldn't see them in school as often, but sometimes they would go to Sunday school. And then middle class students, they found education to be very important because they were looking to move up on the social ladder and kind of go into the higher middle class to the upper class. But the higher class students, really, a lot of kids didn't see going to school as a big deal. It wasn't a huge concern or really a need for them. They were already at that higher class. But some male students, normally, would have higher education, which was really just knowing Greek and Latin back then. So costume of the 1700s. So really was very similar to the 1600s in terms of boys continuing to wear dresses and not being able to really wear their breeches until they were mature enough and able to handle it. But also there were a little bit of differences here. Kind of as you see a lot of women would wear corsets, this here is called a child's stay, and it was worn by children to really encourage proper posture. Again, very mini adultish. A new thing was that John Locke had also influenced that babies were no longer swaddled in the late 1700s. And also clothes became less restrictive around that time as well. So dresses would loosen to be more like frocks, which are kind of just dresses with a sash around them. You wouldn't really see that tight bodice. Also very popular among boys were skeleton suits, which were suits that you often see. They were just tight to the body. That's why they're called skeleton suits. And they became an item for breeched boys. And then also shoes were often made with leather, and girls you would see have a little bit of a heel on them. So now moving on to the 1800s. Due to the Industrial Revolution, there was really demand for child workers, so child labor was really seen back then. Children would often work in textile factories or coal mines. Boys would climb up chimneys to clean them. It was really hard on the children. A lot of times, for example, the textile factories would keep children for 12 hours a day, and really bad conditions. So in 1833 there was a law that limited hours of a factory worker for children, but it really didn't improve conditions much and not necessarily followed very much either. So while children were really working more beyond just the farm and in the home now, they still didn't go to school. So there were the Sunday schools and the day schools. But upper class children often would go, girls would be seen being taught by governesses, and boys would be sent off to school. And then in the middle class, boys would often go to grammar school or elementary school, and girls would go to private schools, and they were taught really what they called accomplishments. So just things like dressmaking and all those talents and skills. And there's still strict discipline. So as I kind of touched on before, this hat here called the dunce hat, it was put on children who either were behaving badly or they didn't understand a lesson. Then the child would wear this, I guess with them thinking the child would either correct their behavior or sit there and really learn the lesson to understand it. So that too, along with still physical punishment, was seen in schools. So toys back in the 1800s, again, still working, but when they did have time to play, girls often were seen with wooden or porcelain dolls, doll houses and jump ropes. Boys a lot of times played with toy soldiers and tops. And this time, because of the Industrial Revolution, some more toys were being manufactured. Still at a small quantity, but it was something new. So costume of the 1800s, children still were wearing similar outfits. There wasn't really a difference in gender. So as you can see here, the boys still in their dresses. But in that bottom picture there, you can see the long tunics over trousers. So that was starting to become more of a thing, even for the younger boys. Another popular thing was the skeleton suit, which we saw back in the 1700s. But now the jumpsuit version was very popular, along with frilled collars on boys became very known too. And then British boys often would wear waist-length jackets and trousers, while the younger boys would wear the skirted outfit. The difference though, for the younger boys with the skirts, they would start wearing vests to give them a more masculine look, which was seen more in the later of the 1800s. Also, knickers were very popular. This was seen in boys from 7 to 14, so the boys that were able to wear pants. And knickers were often paired with jackets, lace-collared blouses, belted tunics, and sailor tops as well. Now, as for girls, their dresses were very similar to adult women, which they kind of always have been, but theirs, of course, were a little bit shorter. They would be around ankle length. And dresses were usually wide off the shoulder necklines and either capped or puffed short sleeves. Many times would have the unfitted bodice, and then it would gather at the waistband and then have the full skirt. Also, a new thing was printed cottons were being seen in girls' dresses, as you can see here with the other blue dress. And another kind of new trend with dresses were pantaloons, which is these, as you can see here with the white dress with the pink sash, the little pants under it. They technically were underwear, but they were just white cotton ankle-length pants that would be seen under dresses. And also in the later 1800s, the bustle look was very popular among women and little girls, because again, girls were dressed just like women. So it would have the same concept of the ankle-length skirt and the bustle in the back. And then in the end of the century, it started to become more popular to have a tailored pleated skirt and then sailor blouses, as you can kind of see here with this little one. Also, another trend was full skirts with a yoke bodice. So a yoke bodice is really a piece of fabric kind of around the neckline, as you can see here, with almost that quilted look on that dress. So that was also very popular. And now moving on with the 1900s. So again, child labor was still a very big thing, especially with World War II and the Great Depression. It was seen often that children would be working again in farms, in mines, factories, selling newspapers, shining shoes. And finally, in 1938, the government started to regulate the number of hours a child could work and minimum ages depending on the job, really. So schooling back in the 1900s, children are really required to go for part of the year now, and it was also more available, so schools started to become free. It was just really recognized that it's important for kids to be in school. And so in the rural areas, the children wouldn't go to school as often because they would have more jobs on the farm. So they were needed to work, so they would only go to school for a certain amount of time. And other schoolhouses were just the one-room schools, and all the grades would be together in that room. So that versus the urban areas, which the schools would be a little bit larger and have different rooms for different grades. And they would be able to go to school longer because they weren't on the farm and needed. But there's still strict discipline going on in schools, still the humiliation factor and the physical punishment. New thing though is the slate and chalk was used. So how did kids of the 1900s have fun? Because again, they still were working and going to school, but some new things were happening that are very exciting for children. For example, toys were manufactured in large amounts, such as the Crayola crayon, and Lincoln Logs were another big one. Bikes and tricycles were often used in the 1900s. They really started becoming more safe in the late 1800s, which then caused the popularity of them in the 1900s. And also parks and playgrounds were being built, so it gave kids somewhere to go to run around and play. And the YMCA and the Boy Scouts were also founded. So again, things with the YMCA and Boy Scouts kind of still had that moral value behind it, giving them skills to prepare as adults. The YMCA gave them somewhere to exercise, and then the Boy Scouts were also like a character building. So costume for children of the 1900s really had a growing emphasis on gendering. There was the use of pinks and blues now, and you would often see boys wearing pants from birth, whereas before they would normally wear dresses up until around 6 or 7. So in this picture you can see that here the little boy in the front wearing the pants and the girl wearing the dress. You can tell a difference now in gender when looking at a photo. Sailor suits were really widely popular up until around the 1940s for boys to wear, and the bloomers or pantaloons also grew during the 1900s for girls, those white cotton ankle-length pants that were worn under their gowns, as you can see here. And it was also really a recognition of play back in the 1900s, whereas before kids didn't get a whole lot of time to play because they were working a lot. So play suits also were popular among kids rather than being in formal wear all the time. In the early 20th century, rompers, overalls, and school uniforms were also very popular. Even private and public schools would wear uniforms often until around the 60s. Girls often would wear navy tunics, and then the boys would wear the pants and the dress shirt and ties. And also after World War II, overalls became a staple among children. So that is it for children, a history of how they lived and what they wore from the 1600s to the 1900s. Thanks for tuning in.